Hi, my name is Craig Foster, and this evening I'm interviewing Les Langford. And what we're going to do, Les, is just perhaps you could give some background. Where were you born? Where did you grow up? And a little bit about how you went into law enforcement, and just kind of a quick overview of your career in law enforcement.
So I was born and raised in southeastern Idaho, Montpelier, Idaho. I went to school at Idaho State in 1968, and I actually joined the LDS Church while I was up at Idaho State. I went in the Marine Corps in 1969. I'm a Vietnam veteran. I got out of the Marine Corps in 1972, and I knew that I wanted to go into law enforcement. At that time, I applied for and was hired by the Utah Highway Patrol. I worked for the Utah Highway Patrol from 1972 to 2002, so I did 30 years with them.
That's great. All right. Well, thank you. So what I want to do is to ask a few questions about your experiences, given that you joined the church eventually. So you were LDS as you were a highway patrolman. What, if anything at all, was the religious atmosphere of the Utah Highway Patrol? And do you think that the LDS Church had significant influence in either the Highway Patrol or perhaps even the American Fork Police Department, if you knew people in the police department?
So actually, when I hired on in 1972, I was quite surprised that there was not a closer relationship with the church. In fact, there was quite a bit of activity that I thought wasn't appropriate, such as drinking. For example, they'd have conventions, and my wife and I would go to these police conventions, and there'd be 3 big vats of cold beer, and there wasn't anything for the kids. And that was the atmosphere from through the 70s clear up into the mid-80s, 1980s. That's since changed, and I'm grateful for that.
A lot of this is based on the series Under the Banner of Heaven, but in the TV series, the police detectives and the officers refer to each other as brother and sister, and even to the suspects as brother. And given my limited knowledge with law enforcement officials, I had never seen that happen before. And I'm wondering, did you see that happen? Was this a common thing?
Never in 30 years.
Okay.
Not with any agency did I ever see that.
Before your first encounter with Dan Lafferty, were you aware of the Lafferty family? Had you heard about them by reputation or seen advertisements for Watson Lafferty's chiropractic service or anything dealing with the Lafferty family?
I knew nothing about the Lafferty family. Before my first contact with Dan, I did read an article that he had published in the newspaper, an editorial about his constitutional views in regards to law enforcement and the laws that were on the books at that time. And that was my first exposure. He was running for sheriff, and he'd written an editorial saying that the majority of the laws on the books were unconstitutional because they prohibited life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. He said that the only legal law enforcement in the state was the elected sheriff. All others were appointed by the executive branch and therefore had no jurisdiction, were not legal. And that's why he was running for sheriff. And if he made sheriff, he wanted to eliminate a lot of the laws that he felt were unconstitutional.
This is a good moment to perhaps ask, and I don't know how much you know about the constitutionalism movement, but I understand that in the 80s at least, perhaps even into the 70s and later in the 80s, there have been some individuals who obviously kind of felt the same way as Dan Lafferty. Could you, if you're aware of that, is it prevalent here in Utah County, and If so, what do you know about it?
That article that I read, and then my subsequent contact with Dan Lafferty, was the first exposure I'd ever had about constitutionalism. Since that time, I've had several contacts, and I've had several run-ins, or you might say, or dealings with constitutionalists and their views, both on the law enforcement perspective, also up at the legislature in some of the bills that were introduced before the legislature.
Okay. And do you know if is there a big following, or do you not know that?
Well, I don't know that at this time. At the time of the Lafferty incident, there was a huge following, and I didn't realize that until we started going to court, and there was huge crowds that would come and actually disrupt court. As Lafferty was convicted of various crimes, and then he went out and does a double murder, his following greatly was reduced.
I can well imagine. Perhaps you could tell us about the different encounters you had with Dan Lafferty, just kind of set up a little bit of a chronology of your encounters with Dan Lafferty.
So like I say, it was the summer of 1982. Dan was running for sheriff, had written an editorial. I had read the editorial, and within just a very few days, I pulled the vehicle over for speeding, and I walked up, asked the gentleman who was driving for a driver's license. He said he didn't believe in driver's licenses, and we had a short conversation, and I asked him for his name. He said his name was Dan Lafferty. I says, "Oh, I read your editorial. You're running for sheriff." And he seemed to brighten right up. You read it? Yes, I did, and I understand your position. Of course, I didn't tell him I disagreed with him. I issued a citation for speeding. I believe I also issued one for no safety inspection. I'm not positive on that. When I walked back up with the citation, he says, "I'm not going to sign it." And I says, "Your signature is only your promise to appear." He said, "If I don't sign it, what will you do?" And I said, "Well, I could arrest you." And he says, "Okay." And he took the ticket and he wrote all over the ticket. He wrote all in the margins and he wrote everywhere, but he never did sign it. And what he was writing was, "I waive none of my constitutional rights, signed under threat of imprisonment," things like that. He never did sign it. I just stood there and let him write all over the ticket. I thought the judge is going to see this. And then I gave him his copy and I left. And that was my first encounter. A couple of months later, I stopped him a second time, had the same encounter. I was talking with another trooper. His name was Gary Johnson, and he said he had the same encounter with Dan Lafferty. So we knew that he'd been issued 3 citations. We made an agreement if anybody else stops Lafferty, or we checked on the citations. He hadn't appeared on any of them. He had 3 warrants for his arrest. They were misdemeanors. And we agreed that if anybody stopped him the 4th time, that we would arrest him. And I am driving southbound I-15 in Orem in a fully marked police car, and Lafferty passes me, going 20 over the speed limit. I radioed for backup. I said, "I'm going to be stopping Dan Lafferty, and I need some backup." And dispatchers knew what the situation was. They sent 2 troopers out. I pulled Lafferty over. I had a good conversation with him. He called me by name and said, "You know, in my position?" I says, "Yes, I do. I understand it." I might add, each time I stopped him, he would only roll his window down a very small distance. And again, I issued a citation. It was the 4th citation. And then I told him, I says, "Mr. Lafferty, step out of the vehicle." And he says, "No." And I says, "Mr. Lafferty, I'm placing you under arrest. You have warrants out for your arrest." And he says, "No." And I turned to the officer who was standing next to me and I said, "Go call a wrecker." My intention was I would just hook on his car and haul the car and him off. As soon as I said, "Go call a wrecker," he dropped the car in gear and took off. We jumped in our cars. We took out after him. We did what's called a boxing technique. I could tell that he did not want to damage his car, because when I would get close, he would pull away. We ended up doing a boxing technique where we had an officer in front, one behind, and one to the side of him. And the place where we did the boxing technique was their steep embankment on the shoulder of the road. Once we got him stopped, my intention was I was just going to go over and break the driver's window and take him in custody. I've broken several windows before with a nightstick, very easy. Unfortunately, one of the troopers, his name was Charlie Wilson, took his handcuffs, reached in that open window about 4 or 5 inches, and placed a handcuff on Lafferty's left wrist. And as soon as he did that, I thought, Charlie, don't do that. Don't put your hands in the window. Lafferty reached over and rolled the window up on Charlie's arms. And I had my nightstick and I started beating on the window. And my intention was to break the glass, but with Charlie's arms in there, all I was doing was damaging Charlie's arms. He was absorbing the shock. In fact, I hit the window so hard that I slid off the window and hit the side of the door. And this white station wagon, there were black marks on the door from where I was hitting the window and sliding off onto the door. Lafferty cranked the wheel hard to the right and drove right off that embankment with Charlie pinned in the windows. The car almost rolled. It came up on 2 wheels. I thought, if that car rolls, Charlie's dead. And at that point, I actually pulled my firearm out, and I thought, I can't get a clean shot. That officer's life is in danger, but there's no way I could shoot. I reholstered the weapon. The car came back down on all 4 wheels, and when it hit, the jar knocked Charlie loose, and he landed on the ground. Lafferty continued to drive down this steep embankment. He paralleled the fence that parallels the freeway, continued on down the bar pit, and then pulled back up on the freeway. The officer who was with me was called Mike Reese, and he ran down to see how Charlie was doing, and I jumped in my car and took out after Lafferty again. Lafferty turned sideways into the road and stopped perpendicular to the traffic. I thought he'd caused an accident. He shut down the whole freeway. He jumped out of his car and he was running up to the cars that were there saying, "Help, stop, be a witness." One of the vehicles that was stopped, the driver of the vehicle contacted us later on and said, "I'll be a witness. He scared me to death. He almost wrecked my vehicle, and I was locking doors and rolling windows up." I ran over at that time and I placed him under arrest. Once I had Dan in custody, I put him in my patrol car and I says, "Dan, you've been a perfect gentleman up to this point. Why in the world did you act the way that you just did?" And at that point, Dan told me, "Go and read Doctrine and Covenants 98. I was not familiar with Doctrine and Covenants 98, but in that, he said it's the 4th time. And Doctrine and Covenants 98 refers to turning the cheek the first time, turning the second time, turning the third time, but on the 4th time you can resist. And he said it was the 4th time. He was charged with assault on a police officer, escape, fleeing, evading. He was charged with several crimes, several of which were felonies. He asked for jury trials on all of the court cases, including all the speeding cases that led up to this incident. The very first hearing that was held, because the case that I just told you about was a felony, it requires a preliminary hearing, and they disrupted the court. And they were led by his brother, Ron Lafferty, and they actually had to shut the court down, and they had to remand Dan back to custody and to jail. And I met with the crowd outside the courtroom and told Ron, standing there toe-to-toe with him, saying, "Ron, I want Dan to be able to tell his story. I want him to be able to tell about his opinions about the Constitution. But you can't do it if you disrupt the court hearings. You've got to be able to have this in an orderly fashion." So that was my first contact with his brother, Ron. During one of the court cases, which was held in the old county building in Provo, Ron brought a brass band, and they were playing the theme for Lafferty, or the theme for Rocky. And Dan came in dancing just like Sylvester Stallone in the movie Rocky, and they were playing that music. Each of the court cases, Dan refused a counsel. He could have been appointed counsel by the state. He said he wanted to be his own attorney. And he even took the stand and testified. And he said he likened this Utah Highway Patrol to the Gestapo, German Gestapo. Said it was a police state, that they were enforcing unconstitutional laws, criticized our uniform and the way that we did things. And his closing arguments to the jury was, I want you to go into that jury room and I want you to pray about this. Every jury came back and said, we did. And we found him guilty. He was found guilty on every charge, on everything. The final court, which was the big one with the felonies, it's district court. He was found guilty of all charges. The judge told him, I could give you probation. You have no criminal record. I don't know what has happened here. Dan said, I would not recognize the authority. I do not recognize the authority of this court. I will not report to a probation officer. I will not do anything this court requests. The judge says, I have no choice then to send you to prison. And he sentenced him to 1 to 5 years in prison. Yeah. That was December of 1982. And that Christmas, his mother called me 3 times at my house and said, my son is in prison. I hope you can live with yourself. You're certainly not a Christian. And she called me 3 times. And when Dan went to prison, they did a psychological evaluation on him. It came back mentally unstable, capable of anything. And after 75 days in custody, they released him. And he never reported to a probation officer. And it was at that point that Ron and Dan grew a beard and started their criminal activity, I would call it.
Yeah. What, if anything, had you heard about Mormon fundamentalists in Utah County to that point? Had you heard very much?
Little. And the reason I say that, I mentioned I didn't join the church until I was in college at age 18. Mm-hmm. At age 19, I'm in the Marine Corps. At age 22, I'm on the Utah Highway Patrol. I never took classes in religion, so to speak.
Right.
In fact, my wife and I, after I retired, served in LDS mission. And it was then that I really started dealing into studying the early church history. Mm-hmm. I was busy raising a family and fulfilling a career.
Making a living, yeah.
Making a living. And I did not know that much about early church history or fundamentalism or any of that kind of stuff.
Okay. Yeah, and it was in this School of the Prophets where Ron Lafferty produced for the group his Revelation, to basically get certain individuals out of the way, with Brenda and Erica being on the list, if I remember correctly, were you on the list also?
Well, that's a point that I need to be careful on, because I was told I was on the list. I never saw the list.
Okay.
I was told I was number 6 on the list.
Okay.
And the detectives that were investigating it, Gary Caldwell, who's now dead, was the one that told me after they had found his journal and found his writings that I was number 6 on the list. But that's hearsay. I never saw that actually, but I was told that.
Wow. That's kind of a good segue into the murders of Brenda and Erica Lafferty. And I realized that you were not directly involved with the case. And so at any point, if you feel that you don't know the answer or whatever, that's fine. But I'll go ahead and kind of ask a few questions in that general area. So, first of all, did you know Gary Caldwell?
Very well.
Okay.
Yes, and Randy Johnson also. Right after those murders were committed, within 1 or 2 hours, they said, this is the Laffertys. And we knew pretty much. It was Ron and Dan Lafferty. And because I had stopped the vehicle so many times, I says, I've got a description and license plate of the vehicle. And I called my wife and I said, you get the kids and you load them in that car and you go up to your mother's house in Idaho. I says, Ron and Dan Lafferty have just committed a double murder and I want you out of that house. I feared for my own family.
Oh, understandable.
Yeah. I then worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, and I had my shotgun out, and I went everywhere I could think of for the next 2 weeks, looking where would the Laffertys go. And I was looking for Ron and Dan. And I thought, when I find them, they better give up with their hands in the air.
From what I understand, Alan Lafferty, when he returned home, it was about 8 p.m. He had been working outside of the county on a job, and he returned home. And long story short, he found his wife and daughter, and had to go over to a neighbor's to make the phone call. And I understand that, of course, with any time you have a crime like this, the police are going to first consider the husband / father as the primary suspect. But within a very short time, and as you said, within at least 2 hours, they realized it was Ron and Dan. Within at least 2 hours, they had an idea that it was the Lafferty brothers, and they I know that they put out an APB on them. And you commented that you were trying to figure out where would they have gone, and were trying to go to the various places that you thought that they might have been. When they arrested Carnes and Knapp, how much did those two men talk?
Well, Chip Carn and I think it was Richard Knapp.
It was, yeah.
Yeah, Richard Knapp. They said they gave them all the evidence they needed. They told them they'd gone to Wendover, of course, and that they got away from Lafferty's, had taken the car, and had discarded out the window as they were driving the murder instruments. And they got over by Palisades Reservoir in Idaho, Wyoming, and discarded the briefcase of Dan's, which included his journal. He kept a very accurate journal. And then they fled on over to Cheyenne, Wyoming, and that's where they were arrested.
And I understand that most of the evidence they actually were able to retrieve.
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah, they retrieved the briefcase, the journal, the murder weapon. They'd sawed a shotgun off. That was another thing. So I was told, and this is hearsay, but I was told that they had taken these instruments, a straight razor and a shotgun. They sawed the barrel off over at their parents' house in Springville, and then they consecrated them for the removal of these individuals that they'd felt had wronged them. I felt that his mother should have been charged with the crime. She was present at that time, as I understand. She was never charged. That's conspiracy to commit murder. And she's a witness to that. One other interesting note, so I was told that how they had killed Brenda, and in fact, I sat in court and listened to the autopsy report and everything. Basically killed her 3 different ways. They beat her. They tied a vacuum cord around her neck and they slit her throat, and they slit it so hard they nearly severed her spinal column. And then Dan went in and killed Erica, the baby, with a straight razor. And he made a comment, or Ron made a comment to Dan, I couldn't have done that. And Dan said he was no problem, or words to the effect of, the Lord was with me, or words to that effect. Again, this is all hearsay. This is just testimony that came out. And it came out through Chip and this Knapp, because they were there at the time. They, of course, had tried to go over to the stake president's house to murder him. Lowe, as I recall his name was.
Stowe.
Stowe.
And Lowe was
and Chloe Lowe.
Yeah, Chloe Lowe.
Chloe Lowe was the stake president, or the Stake Relief Society.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know if she's ward or stake. She was a Relief Society president that had convinced them, their wives, to leave them.
Right.
Both Ron and Dan at this point had been excommunicated. Now, I don't know exactly when they were excommunicated. I thought Dan was excommunicated because of his criminal activity involving my story and going to prison. Randy Johnson claims he was excommunicated before that, so I don't know.
Right.
But I do know he was excommunicated, and so there was. And then, of course, Alan didn't follow their beliefs because of Brenda, and then that's what led to Brenda's demise.
Yes.
So,
were you involved in the trials of Dan and Ron Lafferty? Were you a witness for that? Or?
No, I had nothing to do with the murder investigation. The only thing I did do is the very day of the murder, I contacted the American Fork Police Department with the description of the vehicle, white station wagon, and the license plate number. And so they immediately put out an APB, all points bulletin, on that vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
That's my only involvement. So I had nothing to do with the investigation thereof. The only thing I had after that was Gary Caldwell and Randy Johnson would contact me and kind of update me of what they had learned and what they had found. And as soon as they found Lafferty's and arrested him over in Circus in Reno, they notified me. They knew that I was worried.
Yeah.
I was worried for the safety of my own family.
Yes.
And so that was a big relief off of my mind to find out that they'd been arrested.
Absolutely. In your view, what impact do you think the murders had on Utah Valley, Utah County residents, and just Utah Valley in general?
I think the biggest impact is, like I say, when Dan Lafferty started writing his beliefs on constitutionalism, he had a huge following. And of course, we don't want any of us to have big government telling us how to run our lives. And maybe we start looking at some of the laws that are on the books and say, why do we have those laws? Is that infringing on my personal rights? And the more he got deeper into this and got more in trouble, and then of course now they're doing murders, their following dropped significantly. And so the impact that I felt was people woke up to say, whoa, there's some real nuts out there, and you got to be careful on who you listen to. Today, we have the exact same problem. It's called the internet.
Yeah.
I was talking with a neighbor of mine, and this is a little off the side, but about people who leave the church and how they will go on the internet and believe things that are written, and they have no idea who wrote these. Instead of going, we have it's called the Gospel Library, that is just a wonderful tool. Mm-hmm. And if you have a question, there's an answer in that Gospel Library. And my neighbor, who's a state patriot, says, if you're on a desert and you're looking for a drink, why don't you go to the Oasis? And the Oasis is the Gospel Library where there's all the answers are there if you have questions. And the church has been very open on all the topics. So anyway, that's another side note, but
that's a good point, though. When you would talk with the officers involved with the case, there's debate as to how much with the murders that took place, how much was it religiously based and how much was it we're going to get revenge because these individuals helped our wives leave us, and so do you know, did the officers ever kind of indicate as to whether it was religious based or it was revenge or a combination?
Everything I saw in relation to the investigation by the officers was based on very professionalism. There's a crime being committed here. We're solving this crime, and we're going to bring those to justice that committed this crime. I never saw any religion enter into it one way or the other.
Okay.
It was very professionally handled. The American Fork Police Department and all agencies, that included the FBI and everybody else that was involved with it. It was a crime scene, and they were investigating a crime and bringing the criminals to justice. That's what I saw.
Yeah, that's good. And yeah, I mean, obviously, they were two absolutely horrendous murders, and so I can well imagine the desire of the various law enforcement officials and the professionalism in trying to get this taken care of. Do you think that the Lafferty's extreme behavior, particularly when it came to their views, the revelation of to put these people out of the way, etc., do you think that this extreme behavior and the murders were caused or had a foundation in the teachings and history of the LDS Church?
Well, they obviously, like I say, when I arrested Dan and he told me to read Doctrine and Covenants 98, he obviously had been reading his scriptures. Now, the interpretation thereof and the application thereof, I think, were their own creations.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly wasn't anything from the church, but they definitely were radical in their beliefs, and they were using church doctrine to try to justify their actions.
Those are the questions that I had. Do you have any other thoughts regarding your interaction with Dan Lafferty or what you saw from the case that you think might be of interest?
There was a group back in the 1990s that were going up to the state capitol that were trying to establish rule of law in Utah based on a Supreme Court justice and his writings back in the 1790s. And what his writings was, which was a minority decision, not a majority, was that a jury could be triers of the law and not just triers of the fact. And that's what Dan was trying to say is, and that whole decision was determined in Marbury versus Madison, where they said the Supreme Court determines the constitutionality of a law. If you feel a law is unconstitutional, you take it through the courts, and the Supreme Court in Marbury versus Madison said the Supreme Court determines constitutionality. Juries do not determine constitutionality. Juries are triers of the facts, and the facts are presented before them. They're not triers of the law. And that's kind of what Dan was trying to do is these laws are unconstitutional, so we don't need to obey them. In other words, the individual was judging the law, and that's what he was asking the jury to do, is you have, as a jury, you have the right to judge this law, and you have the right to say this law is unconstitutional. And if it's unconstitutional, then we don't have to obey it, i.e., no registration, no insurance, no safety inspection, obey the speed limit, etc.
Do any of you have any questions that I may have missed?
There was one thing that you mentioned in one of the emails that you didn't mention here, and that's about what Ron said when he was arrested.
Yeah.
About
So
how it was a good thing it wasn't you. I don't know if you wanted to.
Oh,
say
Dan,
that
yeah.
or not.
well,
Yeah.
it was Randy Johnson that told me that, and I talked with him today, and he doesn't remember that.
Oh, okay.
And he said that would be hearsay.
Okay.
And I said, yeah, I heard you say it. I wasn't there, and Randy wasn't there. It was the FBI agent that told Randy.
Okay.
And when Randy got home, Randy and extradited him. And when he got home, he called me and he says, "Hey, I got a story for you to put in your journal." I said, "What's that?" He says, "When they put the gun, I told you he put it at the back of his head. I talked to Randy today, said they put the gun underneath Dan's chin and said, 'FBI, you're under arrest.'" And he turned and looked at him and said, "Well, thank God it's not Les Langford. He'd have killed me, or he'd have shot me, or where's that?" Randy says, "I don't remember that at all." And I says, "Randy, you called and told me that." And he said, "I don't remember that at all." And it's what I remember and what but he called me after he got home to tell me, "Put this in your journal."
Did you keep a journal
No.
during that time?
No.
Oh, that's too bad. Because that is a good story.
Well, what I did do, and I should tell you this, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, I was writing stories for law enforcement.
Oh, okay.
And they were being published. And the Utah Highway Patrol contacted me and they said, "We want you to write the history of the Utah Highway Patrol, and we want you to have it ready for the centennial of Utah, 1996. This is in 1994. And I says, "Okay." And I put 4 stipulations on them. Number one, they have to review everything that I write and they have to approve it. And if they don't like it, they can change it. It's their history.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, I have to have total access to all the records. No files are closed. And number three, I have to be given 1 day a week to do this. I've got 2 years to write this. I can't be just, the last one was I asked for, there was a secretary and a lieutenant colonel that were up at headquarters. I asked that they would be my proofreaders because they were excellent in English. That they would be my proofreaders and that they would review everything. They agreed. And I wrote the Lafferty incident, and that's what I have here today.
Oh.
And this is what was published in 1996. And it's actually on the internet right now.
Is it?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to be going and looking for that.
And I can show you exactly where it is.
Okay.
It's on my website. I have a website.
Oh, okay.
And I also have a ton of church stuff on my website.
Oh, well, then I'm
So
definitely interested.
anyway, anyway, there's a lot of details here and you may be interested in, so I'll leave that with you.
Oh, thank you.
Certainly. And
All right.
I'll show you how to get to that website. And
Yeah,
where it is.
I am interested.
Yeah.
That's excellent. Thank you.